Okay, I hope you enjoyed that little sequence I shot with the Sony ZV-E1 and the new Viltrox 20mm f2.8, which costs only $158. Viltrox sent me this lens for review about 2 weeks ago, and since then I've done a lot of tests, including comparisons to my Sony 20mm f1.8, and today I would like to share with you my honest thoughts on it.
Look at the camera.
Starting with the build quality, this lens is built almost entirely from plastic, including the lens hood, which feels a bit cheap, but it is cheap. It's only $158. It's also very compact and light, about half the size of the Sony 20mm f1.8 and weighing only 157 grams. The body design is very simple. It has a 52mm filter thread, a USB-C port on the lens mount for firmware updates, a decently sized smooth focus ring, and no autofocus manual focus switch, a customizable button, aperture ring, or weather sealing. Moving on to autofocus, I ran a few tests and found that for the most part this lens performed wonderfully, with the exception of a few minor cases where it would hunt with some micro jitters before grabbing focus, especially when shooting in contrasty scenes or when focusing from close to infinity, but for the most part it was almost as reliable as the Sony 20mm f1.8. In terms of focus breathing performance, the Viltrox 20mm f2.8 outperforms the Sony 20mm f1.8, so if you frequently do focus pulling / stacking shots, the Viltrox 20mm clearly wins. Moving on, both lenses have a minimum focus distance of 19 centimeters, but in my tests the Sony lens can focus a little closer than that, and it also produces much sharper results at the minimum focus distance, especially when shooting wide open. Finally, when autofocusing from close to infinity, the Viltrox 20mm f2.8 produces a minor motor noise that can be easily picked by the camera's built-in microphones. Now let's do a vlogging / stabilization test with the Viltrox 20mm f2.8 at f2.8 and active stabilization on my Sony ZV-E1. I think the 20mm focal length is the sweet spot for vlogging. It's not too wide where it creates a lot of distortion, and it's not too tight where you really need to extend your arm to vlog properly. Now, just for comparison, here is how it looks like with dynamic stabilization, which has a tighter crop, but it provides a bit better stabilization performance. And now I have switched to the Sony 20mm f1.8, which is a bit wider actually than the Viltrox lens, I think by about 1mm. And also this lens should provide better stabilization performance because native Sony lenses work much better with Sony cameras in terms of stabilization. And now here is how it looks like with dynamic stabilization. Now let's move on to the optical performance. For the price, I think the Viltrox 20mm f2.8 is good enough. It's neither excellent nor terrible. Taking a closer look at these images, at f2.8 it's sharp in the center, but a little soft in the corners with some heavy vignetting and no major chromatic aberration issues. Here is a side-by-side shot with the Sony 20mm f1.8, and as you can see, the Viltrox lens only has slightly more fringing than the Sony lens, it's barely noticeable. Stopping down to f4 improves overall sharpness, especially corner sharpness, and almost completely eliminates vignetting, and at f5.6 the image is stuck sharp across the entire frame with no visible vignetting. However, when compared to the Sony 20mm f1.8, it clearly exhibits slightly more distortion, but honestly it's very well controlled and can be easily corrected by applying the Viltrox 24mm f1.8 profile until the 20mm profile is released. It's also a bit softer with a noticeable color shift towards green/yellow and has a less wide field of view. For my tests, the Viltrox 20mm feels like a 21mm when compared to the Sony 20mm, and as I mentioned earlier, the Viltrox 20mm is also significantly softer when shooting at the minimum focus distance. Moving on to bokeh, first of all, the Sony 20mm has a bit more bokeh because it has a wider aperture and it can also focus a bit closer, resulting in a much shallower depth of field. Additionally, the shape of the bokeh balls is a bit different. On the Sony lens, they are more rounded and balanced, whereas on the Viltrox lens, they are more octagonal. So what do you think about the Viltrox 20mm f2.8? Is it a good choice or not? Yeah, I think for $158 it's great. Of course, the Sony lens is better, it's sharper, has more buttons on it, the aperturing and stuff, but the Viltrox lens is only $158 and it's half the size and weight. So I think for beginners or for someone who wants to try this focal length, the Viltrox lens is a great option, don't you think? Okay, I'll leave you alone here to chill and chew on the grass. See you.